NPR prides itself on embracing the science. But what embracing the science actually means is things that comport with their ideology. If it doesn't comport with their ideology, they consider it a dangerous idea that should not be platformed.
That's a dangerous idea.
Which is itself a dangerous idea, correct. If it doesn't fit with NPR's ideology, it becomes dangerous. The following story is from 1A. It aired May 4th, 2021. Let's take a listen, and I will say this story is particularly deranged.
This is 1A. I'm Jen White in Washington. The fat acceptance movement has been around for decades, fighting for more inclusive policies for all bodies. But in 2021, it's moved far beyond that. While the average weight of Americans has increased in the last 2 decades, so has America's anti-fat biases. In 2019, a 2019 study based on responses to Harvard's implicit association test found anti-fat bias increased by 40% between 2004 and 2010.
Okay.
I don't even know where to start with that.
Okay, so you haven't listened to this clip yet, so this is good.
This is my first time.
This is going to be fresh for you. I listened to some of it and then didn't want to spoil it just because it was so truly deranged. Okay, so let's take a look at not only the claims they're making, but how those claims are quote unquote investigated or handled by the journalist.
So the first thing I want to say is I am fat, and that's my preferred language to talk about myself and my size and the body that I occupy.
The body that she occupies. Okay, so this is really important from Charlotte Cooper's. She's the main figure in Britain, the fat studies person. So they believe that there are only narratives. There are no... everything is a story. It's a story they tell themselves. So if you'll notice in this piece, they don't use the word obesity when referring to fat people because they think that obesity is a medical narrative, and they believe one narrative is just as legitimate as any other. So you'll notice first thing that they don't use the word obesity.
I think often we are averse to using the word fat and tend to land on these very gendered terms like curvy, plus size, more to love. Okay. I'm going to stop this a lot because this is a lot to unpack.
You know, I think most Americans probably don't know that there is such a thing as a fat studies program, to be honest with you. If you're outside academia, you'd have no idea.
Yeah, and you'd also believe that if you heard it, you would think it did things like measure A1Cs or how many carbs, or do you need electrolytes after you work out or what have you. But it's a fat advocacy. It's to change the moral mind and to accept fat and to promulgate insane notions about, it's called a HAS, being healthy at every size. Okay, so you'll notice also the interspersed, they'll talk about intersectionality, and you'll notice also the gendered and race language. So this is like a suite of ideas that are all bundled together, and that populates this individual's thinking.
Burly, beefy, so on and so forth. And I think that one of the big things we need to do is take away the fact that when I say I'm fat, people often say, oh, no, you're not. You're gorgeous. And those two things can both be true at the same time. I'm both fat and pretty hot. Both of those things are true.
Elizabeth, thanks for leaving us that message. Today we're talking about weight bias and fat acceptance with Aubrey Gordon. She's a columnist at Self Magazine and the author of the book, What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat. Aubrey, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Also with us is Yvette Dion. She's the editor-in-chief of Bitch Media. That's a nonprofit feminist media organization that responds to and critiques pop culture. Yvette, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, we want to note that neither Aubrey nor Yvette are doctors. Often when we talk about fatness, the conversation veers quickly toward the topic of health. Today, our focus is on weight bias.
Funny that. Weird that it would veer towards health.
Weird.
Especially in the midst of a COVID pandemic, which is when this was aired.
Right. And so you would think that they would have what on the show?
You would think they'd have a doctor.
Right. And even more than that, like an internal medicine or someone who specializes in these issues to speak intelligently. Even if you believe it's a narrative, you would still think that you would invite someone on.
You would think. We'll talk about this, I'm sure, later. But the one thing that we knew very early on with COVID was that the two biggest factors in death were being very elderly or being morbidly obese.
Correct.
And the fact that information wasn't spread wider throughout the United States undoubtedly contributed to a lot of death.
I didn't see a single message anywhere from the U.S. Surgeon General, anyone at any level, telling people to, watch their sugar, lower their weight.
That would have been the number one thing you could do to stay healthy during the pandemic. Not put a little cloth mask over your face, but maybe lose some weight.
Correct. And then people wear it below their nose, too. I still see that all the time. Lose weight.
Today, our focus is on weight bias, the way it impacts people in their lives and work, and some of the ways our guests and others are working to make the world more inclusive for everyone.
There it is again, inclusivity. There it is again. It's part of an ideology.
Regardless of body size. So first, I just want to hear from both of you how you define fat acceptance. Aubrey, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, I would say fat acceptance is a movement that has been around, as you noted, for a long time. Some folks will sort of use different names to describe their fat politics. I personally talk about fat justice and fat liberation.
Fat politics, fat justice, fat liberation.
But the basic concept is that stigma isn't helping fat people. It isn't making fewer fat people. It isn't making us healthier. And it isn't creating a better society for any of us. So I would say that.
That's actually a really interesting question.
It's also empirical. So is there less stigma now or more stigma? And do we have more obesity or less obesity? I would argue that now there's less stigma than there would have been, let's just say, the 60s or 70s.
For sure.
And we have far more obesity, which goes completely counter to her narrative. So I'd like to see some data on that.
Sure. It could be that there are other causal factors.
For sure.
But that's the problem when people don't value evidence and they want to push acceptance as opposed to whatever. They look at the whole body of medical literature as a narrative.
So what if she's wrong?
Well, of course, that's backward land.
Yeah.
But it really is an interesting question. What should the role, and this is a little off topic, but I think it's worth mentioning, what should the role of stigma be in society? I think clearly we've stigmatized the wrong things in the past, like homosexuality, etc. But does that mean, I don't know, I just think it's an interesting question. What role should stigma play in enforcing the rules of society? I guess it depends if those rules of society are just and moral, what have you. But all right, anyway.
So I would say that fat acceptance is just simply the idea that fat bodies are a fact of our world and are worth accepting and embracing as they are, not just as sort of before pictures, right? Instead of like in the context of like a before and after weight loss photo, right? Mm-hmm. That we aren't just sort of like waiting to become thin, but that we are people as we are now, and we are people who deserve jobs and healthcare and just like baseline.
Who doesn't think that people who are overweight deserve jobs and healthcare? That's an odd statement to make. I'm curious what fat liberation entails. Liberation from what? Are there laws against
stereotypes,
fat people getting a house?
Yeah, about bodies. It's just such a complicated, nuanced issue that the journalist could have asked so many questions about. It does seem that you have to have some kind of criteria to discriminate against people. Like you can't have a fat stewardess, like a morbidly obese stewardess who has trouble going down the, like you can't have a
Would
blind,
you want
a
a
blind
morbidly
pilot.
obese firefighter?
Huh?
Would you want a morbidly obese firefighter
No.
or a morbidly obese police officer if you need a police officer to be on scene as soon as possible? There's certain jobs where physical fitness is just a requirement. I don't want to see morbidly obese Navy SEALs, as an example. And that has nothing to do with being of discrimination. That has to do with broader concern for the importance of their job and being able to save lives.
Right, so they
the
can
context
discharge
is
their
everything here.
duties. So they can discharge their duty.
So they can discharge their duty. The context is everything here. There's some things that being very fat would prevent you from being able to do.
Correct.
You know, a baseline ability to meet our own needs.
Yvette, what about you?
I agree completely. I would also add that fat acceptance is a movement that treats bodies as if they're acceptable in their current state, that a body is not something that is constantly in flux, and therefore being fat is a choice.
I don't know, like acceptable to do what? Like what? Socially acceptable? Acceptable in what context? Like it's an odd framing for people who believe in the primacy of narratives. So it's like an objective statement about people who fundamentally, and you'll hear it as the piece goes on, fundamentally participate in this intersectionality and broad-based relativism.
Being fat is a choice, that people, no matter what size their body is, deserve, as Aubrey said, access to health care and protections against discrimination in the workplace, and that...
Well, that's the thing. Protections against, obviously they need access to health care, obviously. Mm-hmm. But there are some professions that being obese should just de facto disqualify you.
Correct.
I mean, it just seems so...
Fighter pilot.
Huh?
Fighter pilot. I don't mean to make light of it, but there's so many things that are just very obvious here that there's no context for what she's saying.
A horse.
Right.
Yeah.
A fat person's body is perfectly acceptable in the way that it is. It's not a body that is...
I wonder if they had a wand, if you gave them a wand and say you could wave this wand and you'd lose weight and not gain it back, would you wave the wand? Mm-hmm. Like, I wonder if if they've kind of latched on to this idea, well...
that is in the process of becoming thin.
You know, when we think about Elizabeth's voicemail, Aubrey, I'm curious what you think about the way we describe fat people.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I would just put a big check mark next to everything that Elizabeth said, honestly. I can't tell you how many times I will sort of describe my body in neutral terms when it's relevant and just say, you know, I'm a fat lady and they don't have that in my size or whatever the thing may be, right? And am met with exactly the sort of phenomenon that Elizabeth described, which is like, no, don't say that about yourself. And I think what that reveals to me isn't that I am a bad person for being fat or that being fat is a terrible thing, but it tells me that the person who's trying to dissuade me from calling myself fat thinks of being fat as a really terrible fate.
No. That's the person that's saying that to her is probably trying not to hurt her feelings.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
And that's just a way to go through life where you're just going to have constant conflict everywhere you go. People are trying to be nice to you.
Yeah.
That's basically what it is.
Yeah.
And whatever she's talking about, as far as, we can get into this later, but there always seems to be this obsession with language versus reality, or the descriptor as opposed to what we're actually describing. The problem with being morbidly obese is it kills you.
Right.
It leads to depression. It causes early death. The number one cause of death in the United States is heart disease, followed very closely by cancer, and then we get into like diabetes and things like that.
All those things. Type 2 diabetes is a complication from her weight. The doctor
all
said
those things are made far worse when you're morbidly obese. And it was the same thing with COVID. We saw so many people who were morbidly obese that died from COVID. And we know, forget about all this concern over language, in terms of reality and studies, we know that people are a lot happier and a lot healthier when they lose weight.
Yeah, and I know that when I've been overweight, I haven't been comfortable in my body.
No.
So I can't believe that going up even more weight would make you...
Part of not being comfortable isn't because the world's imposing this not being comfortable on you.
Right.
Part of not being comfortable is the fact that you don't feel good.
That's exactly
which is why people tend to die, because it causes your heart to give out and different things like that. There's a serious issue here of medical issue that's not even being addressed, that they're pretending doesn't exist, as if changing the language would somehow solve that problem. That problem's not going to go away.
They don't have a doctor on the show.
No. But we don't need a doctor on the show. I mean, how many studies do we have?
You'd kind of need, well, you need one, You need some kind of pushback.
Well, you should, yeah, but we don't need one to show that how unhealthy it is for you to be morbidly obese. And there's a big distinction between being slightly overweight and being uncomfortable with your body image, which comes from social media and all kinds of stuff, and that's a legitimate concern, and being morbidly obese. Right. Someone who weighs 400 or 500 pounds.
Or even 300 pounds.
350 pounds. Their entire life is altered. The things that they can do and not do is changed.
The quality of life is
dramatically decreased. Yeah. And everybody knows that.
Right. Thinks of being fat as being potentially unlovable, unwantable, unworthy, all of these different things. And I do think there's quite a bit of space to sort of interrogate,
there's another word,
ways in which we think and talk about fatness and fat people, and how we can do that in a way that is respectful of the language that fat people choose to use for ourselves, and in a way that sort of, again, interrogates our own sort of preconceptions that we bring to conversations about fatness and fat people. And those preconceptions often end up sidelining.
There's the language thing again. And, when you hear this word interrogate, that's a kind of, it participates in this broader quote unquote discourse, critical social justice.
Sidelining the actual wants and needs and autonomy of fat people.
Yvette, how has the way you think about yourself and your body evolved over time?
It has evolved considerably. When I was growing up and I have been a fat person, I was a fat child. So I've been a fat person for the majority of my life. And I thought for a long time about fat as a sort of pejorative, or fatness almost as if it were a curse. Something that my body had been cursed with and that I needed to exercise and shed in order to be treated acceptably in our society. And
it's funny that the concept is like that the problem is externally with other people.
Right. It's what she seems to be trying to do is to control how other people speak and the language they use, which is backwards instead. And I think this is one of those lessons we're supposed to learn when we're in kindergarten. Instead of trying to control how other people speak, what you should be doing is control how you react to what other people say.
Yeah, we've also moved away from the sticks and stones may break my bones. But there's no how I feel when I gain 10 pounds or when I lose 10 pounds. There's no, that would comport with their ideology of subjectivity, feelings, etc. But it's just this idea that the problem is externally how this is perceived as opposed to any other problem.
Look, if you're going to go through your life trying to control the language everybody else uses, whether you try and control that legally or just by being aggressive all the time and confronting people, you're going to be miserable.
Yeah.
Add on an extra 200 pounds and you've got a real recipe for disaster here.
Right.
In order to be able to go to school and not feel like I had this target on my back. But as I got older and I came into the fat acceptance movement as a young person in my 20s.
There's a movement for this. There's a movement for this.
Yeah.
There's a movement to try to change other people's attitudes and language as opposed to...
How about a movement to get Americans to eat healthier?
Yeah.
That'd be worthwhile.
I came to realize that there was a different way in which I could think about my body and the way it moves through the world, and that there were other people, a community of people who were doing that unlearning work together.
Unlearning work. A community of people who just even think about the mental gymnastics it takes to justify this to yourself. They have a community of other people who have this idea that she is that, and I love the use of the word community, it's everywhere now, who she has kind of plugged into to give justification for her, I don't know, health issues, body size, whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
And to be quite frank, it was mind-blowing to me. It was fascinating to me. It allowed me to think and theorize about what my body does when it moves through the world, how it is purposely disruptive, the history of that.
This is all language from critical theory, all of it.
And the ways in which I could use that in some respect to my advantage in terms of fully understanding what it means to have a fat body and then advocating for myself.
But I think it's just the opposite. I think that this takes her away from reality.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So she thinks she's gaining understanding of what it means to have a fat body, but exactly the opposite is happening.
For myself, in the places where I see that my fat body is thought about differently in the way that I think about it myself. And so now that I'm in my early 30s, I think far less about my body itself and far more about how we can create a world that is more inclusive and accepting.
Bingo. It's the move toward the other person, and the rejection of personal responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And tolerant and welcoming to all fat people and all people whose bodies are considered or perceived as deviant.
Did you notice that little slip in there?
Deviant.
Yeah, deviant.
I don't know anybody that thinks of obese people are necessarily deviant.
Yeah, and I was thinking, like, what is she talking about? Handicapped people? Is it a way to like throw what is the? But again, I would love the interviewer to say, well, what do you mean by deviant? What does that mean?
We got this email from Edward who says, I'm 75 years old and have been a fat person all my life. I have a long history of the fat experience from both the discrimination standpoint and from the experience of underestimated expectations from coworkers and people in my community. People lack awareness that they have a fatness bias based on my looks. In spite of my fatness, I have overcome roadblocks and have had a very successful life. This came from understanding and embracing my fatness and creating an approach to dealing with people as a fat person. I've had a career as an engineer, manager, and journalist, overcoming fatness obstructions in my personal and work life.
That just seems. What am I missing about this story?
Well, there's no data. There's no information. I don't know what she means by fatness obstructions. Like, what does that mean exactly? Does that mean that she couldn't be, for example, a firefighter or airline, a pilot or something? I don't know. What is the obstruction due to her weight?
Yeah, and the other thing, the journalist doesn't even have to really push back, but they can just ask thoughtful questions like, well, what do you mean by that? Well, give me an example of that.
Aubrey, where do you see weight bias the most in society?
Weight bias, that's the other thing.
Well, that's a big question. So, I think one of the ways is the one that was just lifted up by your listener, which is job discrimination.
Have you noticed a big question lifted up by the listener? Have you noticed like all the language about weight in here?
Job discrimination is a real issue. So 28% of fat women and 23% of fat men report experiencing overt job discrimination. And there are sort of salary surveys and research that's been done that show a range of sort of differences, but they reliably show that fat people, and particularly very fat people, make significantly less money.
Yeah, maybe there are other causal factors at play. Maybe they suffer from depression and they eat, and there could be a myriad of other reasons for that.
Than those who are seen as being thin or having a quote unquote healthy weight.
Did you catch that too? Quote unquote healthy weight. Quote unquote.
As if that's under debate.
Right.
One of the most sort of striking of those estimates showed that fat people may make up to $19,000 less each year than their thinner counterparts. So that's a major one. I would say for me personally, there are two places where it comes up the most. One is in the airplanes when I'm flying, which I'm not currently doing, as many of us aren't. But there is just sort of astonishing levels of scapegoating, of sort of dirty looks, but also people who are willing to complain about me and are sort of gunning to get me kicked off of a flight, right? That's happened to me a number of times, that folks will just sort of openly complain about my body in my presence, often to the flight crew and often with the express request that I be removed from the plane.
Okay.
I've actually had this happen. I've seen this happen because I fly all the time for my job.
Yeah.
What's probably going on there is she's probably taking up 3 seats. Half the seat on her left and half the seat on her right. And the other person isn't able to either sit down or get comfortable, and they're getting crushed by it.
Yeah.
And they're uncomfortable by it. And that's not because they hate fat people. It's because they paid a lot of money for that seat, and they would like to have the actual, whatever amount of inches they paid for as far as that seat goes.
Correct. I think that the way to think about that is those people paid for the seats, but if she wants to pay for 2 seats, she's certainly welcome to do that. And my guess is if she did that, Nobody randomly is going to go around and complain about people. At least not that I've ever seen. I fly all the time.
There'd be no reason to.
I should say I wear a size 26.
I don't have any idea how big a size 26 is.
Pretty big.
I would imagine if people are complaining about her in her presence.
So I'm sort of right on the edge, frankly, of a one seat or two situation. And I think that often folks don't know that even when we buy a second seat, those second seats may be resold. We may pay for a second seat that isn't actually available.
I'm not sure if you buy a second seat, how it can be resold.
Well, she could complain about that. They'd give her a different flight. That's happened to me before where the flight's been oversold, but that's the airline's problem. You paid for the seat. They'll arrange for that to be taken care of. I have a story about this that I can relate directly to what she's talking about that I'll talk about after we go through this story. But, she only has two options here, right? Option one is we can arrange airlines and airplanes and bathrooms and restaurants and everything else to accommodate somebody who's 350 pounds, in which case now we have to legislate that, and all the airlines have to have these much wider seats and everything to accommodate this small percentage of people. And then we have to do the cost-benefit analysis of that and think if that would be overall good for the vast majority of people. And I don't think it would be. I think it would probably prevent airlines from operating and from us even being able to have a commercial airline if the seat had to be big enough to accommodate 350-pound people. Option two, she can try and lose some weight. That's basically it. Like, there's certain things she's not going to be able to do. She's not going to be able to be an airline fighter pilot. She's not going to be able to be a SEAL. She can't be a fireman. We don't want to change the world to accommodate 350-pound people everywhere.
Yeah, I remember I read a story about, I think it was in San Diego. They had to accommodate the bathrooms for, I think this was in San Diego, and the cost of retooling the bathrooms for morbidly obese people was astronomical. Yeah. So they just said, let's close down.
A lot of small businesses would just go out of business. Yeah. So I think if people took an objective look at that, they'd see it's a bad idea. So what does she really want to have happen?
Yeah, and if she can't afford two seats, well, then she can't afford two seats. I mean, I don't know. Again, it's really interesting. It's the idea that it places the onus external to herself.
Right.
That feels like a big one to me, is airplanes and airlines. And the other one that I would say is in the doctor's office. Just personally speaking, I have had doctors who refuse to touch me and refuse to examine me because of my body.
I find that hard to believe, but okay, maybe, okay.
I've had, medical techs who have taken my blood pressure.
Maybe someone didn't touch her and she said, oh, it's because I'm fat. I mean, that's the doctor's job.
Yeah.
Fire them and get a new doctor. That's unethical.
If I was a doctor and saw somebody morbidly obese coming in to see me, I'd be happy. That's where they belong. I'd come in and talk to them about losing weight.
Taken my blood pressure 3 or 4 times because they couldn't believe that it was, a sort of standard blood pressure, right? That it wasn't elevated.
Well, yeah, of course you would do that. Of course you would take it because you would think you made a mistake because it's normative. The norm is you would be surprised by that and say, oh, maybe I made a mistake. Let's take it again.
And they have told me so overtly that, I'm taking this again because normally obese patients have elevated blood pressure, right?
See, did you notice they use the word obese there in a medical context, but every other time it's been fat?
And it doesn't exactly instill confidence to hear from a healthcare provider that they can't actually believe that you are healthy, at least in one small way, right?
I think she'd rather have them lie to her.
Yeah.
It's good for you to be 350 pounds. Yeah. Don't worry about it. Your blood pressure will be just fine.
Yeah.
That feels really challenging and disheartening. And research shows us that is sort of borne out. Basically, anytime we have looked for bias amongst healthcare providers who are doing incredible work and who receive extensive technical training, they don't necessarily receive training on how to, interrogate their own biases, on how to treat fat patients differently or better.
Interrogate their own biases to what? Someone who's coming in with a health risk for heart disease, for diabetes.
Probably the single biggest health risk that we know about, yeah.
What biases ought they to even the idea of I mean, it's just the data.
Mm-hmm.
And it shows up with less patient rapport and shorter visits and fewer tests and treatments offered, right? So there are sort of really concrete effects of that bias that show up for me and for other fat people as well.
Yvette, I wanted to hear from you on this question of where you see this bias showing up most for people.
It shows up everywhere, to be quite honest. The discrimination against fat people and the anti-fat bias is something that is a part of the fat experience in every facet, in every way.
I don't know. Should we listen to more of this clip?
No.
I don't know.
No.
I mean, I'm kind of done with it. I mean, the rest of it is like, there's like 15 minutes left that's super interesting. They say even more deranged things.
I want people to be comfortable in their body. I want people to be happy. There's a wide range it is true that there's a wide range of what healthy looks like. And, the old body fat indicator where you have to be a certain percentage for a certain height is outdated. And there's a lot of people who can be
stuff.
Yeah. There's a lot of people who can be stockier and a lot of people who can be thinner and they can be perfectly healthy. And a lot of that has to do with your physical fitness more than it does how you look. That's, again, very, very different from being obese. If you are morbidly fat, your entire quality of life is going to go down the drain. You're going to be depressed, and trying to get the rest of the world to accommodate you is a ticket for misery. So hopefully there's not too many morbidly obese people that listen to this NPR story and drink the Kool-Aid because it's a recipe for being completely unhappy. Instead, you need to go talk to your doctor, go out there and take care of your body,
and
you'll feel a lot
expect your
better.
doctor to be honest with you.
Of course. If your doctor's not honest, find a new doctor.
Right.
Don't get the doctor who tells you what you want to hear.
Right. And the other thing is the young girls are susceptible to this. We'll try to, if I remember, I'll put a link in the YouTube for the data on that. Fat studies programs were once the rage. They are this idea of applied postmodernism. Again, it's kind of an offshoot of that. This kind of anti-scientific claptrap garbage nonsense that NPR is putting out is hurting people. Mm-hmm. This is hurting people.
And the idea, like she talked about, I think she said obese people on average make $14,000 or $15,000 less. Did they control for something like, for example, education?
Yeah, or you couldn't even get in. You can't physically get to work because you're sick because you have diabetes. I mean, who knows?
There are so many other factors that you could control for. So the idea that the way NPR throws out data like that is it bad thinking, bad idea. The whole thing is bad. This is a terrible, terrible episode. I hope not many people heard it.
Thank you for watching this excerpt from an episode of All Things Reconsidered. To watch the full episode, please follow the link in the description.